This is Growth Guide, a podcast exploring the depths of curiosity, questioning everything in the name of growth. I'm your host, Brian D'Alessandro. My guest today is Steven Haynes, founder of Fjord, a Norwegian-inspired cold water therapy company based out of Austin. They sell premium cold plunges to bring cold water immersion to high performers and busy professionals looking for a physical and mental edge. By now, just about everyone and their mother has heard about the cold plunge trend, from the likes of Wim Hoff, Rogan, and Gwyneth Paltrow's Goop, or Tony Robbins. But while it's getting a ton of attention these days, cold water immersion therapy has been around for thousands of years. In fact, the earliest documentation is from this papyrus back from 3500 BC, where they were using cold water immersion for therapy in humans. The resurgence of the popularity likely comes from the advancements in science that have allowed us to prove many of the benefits of cold water immersion therapy, such as stress management, recovery, sleep regulation, immune system fortification, and even mental resilience. That's why I'm speaking with Steven today, as he's a strong proponent of cold, hard facts to drive his data and product set. Like most entrepreneurs, Steven started as a pure passion project, tinkering in his garage to build the best home cold plunge that he could. He wanted performance that got cold fast and stayed cold through multiple uses, as his friends would be hanging out and they would experiment. After numerous versions he made for himself and friends, he kept on getting orders to the point where they were taking up so much of his day that he had to switch over and make this a bigger commitment. The products are really high quality, and they even have options to work as cold plunge and hot tubs. And the pricing is really, really solid when you compare it to a lot of the overpriced models that are out there on the market. So today we'll cover various topics like protocols, benefits of cold plunging, as well as some of the science behind it. So without further ado, let's get to it. Welcome, Steven. Glad to have you here.
My pleasure. Thanks for having me, Brian.
Yeah, absolutely. So we've connected around cold plunging as it's near and dear to your heart. And in fact, you run a company, Fjord, which is a cold plunge company. I'd love for you to give us an overview of what you're doing there, and let's get into some of the nitty-gritty on cold plunging and benefits.
There's a lot to talk about when it comes to the benefits of cold water immersion. I guess to begin with my story, my background is actually in management consulting. So I did that for 15 years. And last year decided that I wanted to go ahead and have my own cold plunge. So I endeavored to build my own, which I did. And that ended up turning into a situation that evolved into a business, because as my friends would come over and play with my cold plunge, we would get in and do challenges and have fun with it. They would say, "Can you build me one?" So I built one, and then I built 6, and then I started getting orders for cold plunges, and it evolved into something that ended up taking over such a full-time aspect of my life that we've now evolved the product and created it into a business, and it's just been an incredible amount of fun. I know we're going to talk about community. Community has been a huge aspect of the business and helping us get off the ground. So that's a little bit of the genesis of where the idea came from.
And when you were starting out building your own, because I've gone down the rabbit hole, there's a lot of YouTubers out there that have all these different methods for building home cold plunges. How are you starting out? I'm curious to hear the genesis.
Yeah. So do you know Jesse Itzler? He's
he's doing his rim to rim challenge right now.
Right. So I follow Jesse Itzler and have for a few years. He's one of my mentors from afar, if you will. And I noticed from All Day Running, the running group that he runs, that they had these cold plunges that they were using post-exercise. And they were using these giant coolers, and they were just stuffing them with ice and letting athletes cool off after a run. And I thought, I'm going to find that cooler and develop a cold plunge that doesn't require ice. So simply bought all the components, paid retail for everything, drilled the holes in my back patio, cut up my knuckles, putting on all the fittings, learned how to make it not leak. And that was the very first prototype.
I love hearing that, because there's a lot of plunges out on the market, and you could tell that a lot of them are the same thing, that are just white labeled and brought in from China and just slapped with a different logo on it. But you are a tinkerer and you design stuff yourself, and that works out a lot of the issues. Yeah, what are some of the challenges you ran into and how did you improve upon those to get where you are now?
It took me more time and more money than I ever imagined to be able to develop the product to where it is today. I honestly spent about 5 months and over $25,000 of trying to find the right equipment setup that performed at a level where I would be proud to own the product and would be proud to hand it to my friends and the people in my community and my customers ultimately. So it involved a lot of experimentation and learning a lot of equipment that has failure points and how to get around those failure points to not use types of equipment that don't have the high level of performance that we command at Fjord for our products. And I also wanted something that was for the customer all in one, that looked clean, what I call apple-fied aesthetics, to where you don't have a lot of components or piping or tubing that is exposed, because this is something that my customers think about as a piece of their landscaping. 95% of these are put outdoors in someone's yard. And a lot of my customers are people that have well-maintained yards, and this is a part of the aesthetics of what they welcome people over into when they have people over. So that was important to us as well.
Let's get into some of those other variables. So you're dealing with getting the water to a certain temperature, keeping it there, even as warm bodies are going in and out. If you have multiple people, there's a circulation, there's making sure that it stays decontaminated. Can you give us a lay of the land with those variables, just so people understand it?
Sure. I love that we're getting into the cold plunge logistics here. When I was doing some of my primary research in the beginning, just to understand what would be important to build towards, I interviewed some gyms that already had cold plunges from other companies. And one of the most common complaints that I would get from the gyms is that with high frequency repeat use of their members, oftentimes they're getting out of a sauna, so their body's already heated up, and they're getting in the water, they're doing 3 minutes, and they're going back to back. And they complained that they would have the cold plunge set at, let's say, 42 degrees in the morning. And by lunch, it's already up to 50. By the afternoon, it's up to 62. And members start to complain, hey, I'm not getting the cold exposure that I wanted. So I knew that there was a chiller power element that was going to be important that I wanted to overbuild for. So the power of our chillers is intentionally set a bit higher so that people can use it for B2B applications, such as in gyms where you have high frequency use, or even for somebody like yourself, Brian, that has people over to the house after a workout and you're hitting it with repeat hits. We want to make sure that the water stays as cold as possible. And then you talked about sanitation. We have a pre-filter and a filter on ours, along with an ozonator. You can use a lot of different sanitation protocols. So people use chemicals at times. You can use hydrogen peroxide. You can use a little bit of chlorine in addition to the actual hardware itself. But people can use UV, O3, or ionizers to keep the water clean in terms of sanitation. So we've chosen O3 at this point.
This episode is brought to you by Zero Shoes, barefoot-inspired minimalist shoes with a natural fit and feel that supports natural motion. All right, guys, so I've dealt with knee pains and foot issues pretty much my whole life. I could never run more than a mile because of it. I always just wrote it off and said, all right, I'm just a sprinter. But the reality was there were underlying issues. And I was using things like orthotics. When I went to the doctors, they brought up surgery as an option, which I knew was ludicrous. So I tried a bunch of different things. I did physical therapy. I worked through building up my arches with yoga. And while some of these things helped, nothing allowed me to run until about a year and a half ago, where I listened to a buddy of mine who always wore barefoot shoes, and I tried a pair of Zero shoes. These are zero drop shoes, which means the sole is much thinner and it allows you to have much more flexibility and contact with the earth, but also they have a wide toe box, which allow your feet to open back up into their natural form. What we don't realize is with traditional shoes, we're binding our feet to the point where after a year and a half, I can't wear any of my old shoes because when I do, my feet are so bound and blistered. Since switching to zeros, I'm running 2 to 5 miles comfortably about 3 to 4 times a week. So I definitely want to share it with you guys. Check out Zero Shoes. Huge fan.
Very cool. So, Stephen, obviously there's a lot of talk about cold plunging and cold water immersion. Can you give us a lay of the land of the benefits and some of the different variables that go into it?
Happy to. I want to try to surprise you here, Brian, with one that you might not expect to come first, but this is one that there's not as much coverage on, which I find very interesting, which is the cold plunge benefits for mental health. So this blew my hair back whenever I first heard this statistic. According to a Johns Hopkins survey, they found that 1 out of 5 adult Americans struggled with chronic depression. And some other studies actually rank that as high as 1 out of 4 Americans that struggle with it. You and I probably both know people that do. And the good news is cold water immersion has a pretty potent effect on your mental health. It's super interesting. There was a 2020 randomized control trial. And in the trial, they took 92 participants. And these 92 participants had been diagnosed with clinical depression. They were on antidepressant medication. And then they divided these into 2 cohorts. And the first cohort was exposed to 10 sessions of cold therapy. They took the other group and they exposed them to milder temperatures for 10 sessions. Then they compared the outcome of these 2 cohorts, and the cold exposure cohort actually reported reduced depressive episodes, as well as overall perceived improvements in their quality of life compared to the other group. So pretty interesting. If you look at it from this study and from others that have literature around this in the medical journals, cold plunging actually serves as an all-natural, non-pharmacological intervention for the treatment of depression. I think that's incredible, in my opinion.
Yeah, it's huge. And as you said, the number, it's a bit of a moving target with how many people are suffering from depression in America. And I'll specify America, not only just because we're here, but this is the epicenter of this epidemic that we're experiencing of chronic health issues, autoimmune, pharmaceutical based, and there's just such a compounding level of chronic stress and anxiety, and layer on top of it social media and screen time and everything else, and the intensity and the way that work is being treated in this country. And so it's a big one. And I especially look towards our younger generations, where we have more and more of these kids being diagnosed with depression, anxiety, and the typical path is to throw them onto pharmaceuticals. I don't remember what the stat is, but the amount of kids that are taking more than one pharmaceutical by the age of 12 is just absurd. So any solutions to that are natural, I think we're insane not to give a lot of attention to. So can you talk to some of the ways that this works?
Yeah, definitely. I would say that probably some of what they discovered in terms of these benefits can't be explained or isn't well understood yet. But one of the really potent pieces of the mental health aspect of cold plunging is related to the dopamine release that you get following cold water exposure. You may have heard this statistic, but after cold water exposure, doing what I would call a proper cold plunge, and we'll talk more about protocols and what a proper cold plunge entails later, you get about a 2.5x increase from baseline on your dopamine levels. And there was a viral video that was created by Dana White on social media, and this fact has been repeated, so you may have heard this, but I think it's really a provocative way to look at this. They talk about cold plunging versus using cocaine. And they said when you use cocaine, incidentally, it also gives you a 2.5x boost of dopamine, but it only lasts about 30 minutes. So you hear stories of people needing to go back and repeat the drug use and repeat it over a night sequence or however it's being used to get the same effect. And with cold plunge, you get a commensurate amount of this dopamine release that lasts for hours. So if you were to do a cold plunge in the morning before starting your day, that feeling of motivation, of mental being, actually carries into the workday and carries throughout really the afternoon and evening. And we'll talk more about some of the other benefits as well. But from a mental health perspective, I think a lot of it really is explained by the dopamine.
Yeah, and let's stick on dopamine for a little bit longer because it's funny. Before you gave that example, I went to the comparison of the false dopamine hits we're getting from screen time, right? From social media, that they're designed to give you those hits and to create that addictive nature. And we create this dependency on it. And our body is not able to do what it does naturally. And so this being a natural way, and does this tie into the heat shock proteins that are released? And is that all tied in with how this is working?
It is. I will say I don't know the deep science behind the mechanism of action that kicks off the dopamine release. I believe it is related to when you first get in the water, there is the cold shock response. And what's happening there is a chemical cascade that gets kicked off when you get into the cold. And one of the first things that happens is you get a release of epinephrine or adrenaline, right? Same thing. And then a release of norepinephrine. So you have these cold receptors in your skin. And immediately when you get in the cold, it's non-negotiable medical biology that no one can avoid. Whether you're well-trained or it's your first cold plunge, it's going to happen. You're going to get that feeling on the skin, which sends a signal to down a pathway to your hypothalamus in your brain. And when your hypothalamus gets that signal, it then sends a signal to your body to release those chemicals. And as that happens, there's a number of things that happen downstream from that. But the dopamine release is partly a result of that chemical process.
I think there's something so powerful and beneficial. I don't have the science behind it, but just the act that you're experiencing a real event that is sending your body into a fight, flight, survival mode that it is designed to give. We experience so many of these under false conditions, the stress of our day-to-day life where we're not under any actual threat. It's false events appearing real, right? Fear in that sense. Whereas these, the saber-toothed tiger version of fear, which are warranted and beneficial, don't get kicked in that frequently. And cold plunging does that. And the interconnectivity between all the parts of our body that engage when it's a real one is very different for me than when I'm getting anxious because I'm late for a meeting or something that is not an actual real threat.
That's right. That's right. And what we refer to that as is resilience. It helps build mental toughness and resilience because, to your point, Brian, you're intentionally doing deliberate cold exposure, putting yourself into a stressor. And it's kicking off similar chemicals with epinephrine and norepinephrine that you would get if you had a fight with your partner or someone honks at you in traffic or you get a bad email at work. So all these stressors that unexpectedly come our way, if we can build some resilience to that with deliberate cold exposure, and that's a really healthy way for us to then have a productive response to that stress, being able to stay calmer, have a cleaner, clear mind.
So this starts bridging from the mental health benefits into the mental resilience and the mental strength space of really cultivating that mental strength. The history of the Stoics comes up a lot in this space of choosing to do something challenging despite every cell in our being not wanting to do it. And this is what a lot of people who cold plunge regularly talk about, right? That doesn't necessarily go away.
That's right. I don't have a podcast, Brian, but I have something called a plunge cast where we get high performers in the 2-person cold plunge and we expose them to the cold while we have a fun conversation. I typically like to interview high performers in some regard in their field. So the very first one I did was with an ultra runner who's done the Moab 240 a couple times. He's done Leadville. He's a hardcore ultra marathoner, Brent Drake. And when I asked him why he cold plunges, aside from the recovery benefits and so forth, he said, because there are so many hard things mentally that you face in ultra running and just in life in general, that I don't want to wait until hard things come to me. I want to go to hard things. I'm going to pursue that and I'm going to overcome it. And as soon as I overcome that, I'm able to overcome other things and intentionally put myself into a Moab 240 race where I'm running for 3.5 days. beating up my feet and my body, and then being able to see that as an overcoming experience.
Yeah, we've spoken about this a little bit previously, and that idea of choosing to do these hard things. And I love the plunge cast idea as well, because the aspect of that, what is the longest one that you've done to date?
I did one where the recording unedited was about 18 minutes.
So it's beautiful.
We were shivering so hard. I was hoping that you could still understand us on camera there.
But that's the beauty of it. It's the healthy version of, I forget the name of it, but the hot wings one where they do different hot sauces, right? This is
correct.
There's brilliance in it. So I love that. Keep it going. But this notion of training for hardship, so much of our lives, we live in that unknown, that question of, what would I do if I was put in that situation? And this affords the ability to do that. And you start learning things about yourself for sure, but also about these things. There becomes more of a distance between the thing that we're fearing and the actual event that unfolds. And there are some consistencies that start to reveal themselves about hardship. And one of them, for me, the biggest one, and I just had competed in my first High Rocks event, hybrid racing event, and you're pushing your body and mind. And the biggest thing I learned is that it's not that it gets harder until you find a point to quit and then it's just done. It actually is going on a wave. And if you could just survive long enough of enduring it, it then drops off and it comes back down. And you get some momentary relief where you can gather yourself. And then it starts to build up again. And you go through the same thing of wanting to quit and throw in the towel and all of the narratives that come out of projecting it outward onto someone else, or your old inner voice or critic or inner child that's wounded, and all of these things start going. But each cycle becomes another opportunity to work with that and to cultivate a new relationship internally, which transfers to externally.
I love the way that you just brought that up, Brian. And it's so true. Any athlete that's gone out there to do any kind of hard exercise probably can really relate to what you described. With cold plunge specifically, I actually think about it and talk about it in terms of crossing different walls. There's really 4 walls that you can cross in cold plunging, 4 basic walls, and then you can add more from there. And so I think about this as these hurdles, these challenges. The first wall would be the decision to get in the plunge. Before you're even in the water, making that mental decision builds some toughness, builds some resilience. The second wall is actually immersion all the way up to the neck, total whole body immersion. Making the decision and going ahead and getting immersed. The third wall, which will come at different times for different people based off how cold adapted you are. But this is the wall where you get that first feeling of, I am uncomfortable and I want to get out of this water. And for some people, that's going to be 10 seconds. And so from some people, that's 1 minute, maybe 2 minutes, and so forth. But inevitably, you're going to hit a wall where you want to get out and you feel a little uncomfortable in the cold. And that's a good thing. So that's the third wall. And then if you keep pushing and keep waiting, to your point, you start to then relax. You start to enjoy the experience. Some people have a meditative experience in the cold. And you hear people say things like, oh, it's not so bad anymore. And then eventually you will hit that fourth wall where it then does become cold again. And maybe you begin to shiver. You want to get out, you're uncomfortable. So it's really just one of the things that I tell people is, if you want to challenge yourself doing cold plunge, is to set a goal for how many walls you want to overcome. So when that fourth wall comes, wait it out, wait another 30 seconds, wait another 1 minute. And then if you're able to keep going, wait for the next wall and continue, and so forth.
Brute force training is my go-to for high-quality, durable workout gear. From sandbags and sandbells to rucksacks and weighted vests, these guys are consistently innovating and improving to make their gear work even better. They're vet-owned, so they know a thing or two about being battle-tested. crafted in the USA to withstand the most grueling workouts. I grab the sandbag when I go on family walks, or I use it in high-intensity interval training to get a killer full-body workout while only needing one piece of gear. I also travel with my sandbag. I just empty it out, folds up, and then when I get there, I fill it up and I'm good to go. Brute Force is doing a lot of work around unstable load training, which when combined with breath work and a mindful practice, it supports healthy regulation of your central nervous system. In normal speak, that means you're able to be more effectively navigating the challenges that life throws at you. Check out their full line of gear at bruteforcetraining.com/growth to get 10% off.
Those 4 walls are brilliant. The structure, the framework of it, and I think it's really accessible for everybody. And there's so much we can unpack in each of those for sure. One of the other things that has been fascinating for me is learning that these waves or walls that we're talking about, it doesn't matter if you're Joe Schmo like me, who was just training for my first fitness event, just trying to survive it, or you're one of the elite athletes. I just spoke to someone else who ran 100K for the first time. Everyone has these same cycles. They look different for different people, and there might be more at stake, but they're the same. And so these are biologically and physiologically hardwired. And so when we can use that as a practice for ourselves, there's so much room for improvement, where things like anxiety or depression, we're taught, and a lot of this is subconsciously, but we're taught that we've got it. And if we do, it's something that we have for life, and it's going to be the same. It doesn't stay the same. Our relationship to it can change, and the integration and rewiring of the nervous system and the neurology can also change to support that. This practice is very real in how you can cultivate the lifestyle that you like.
It really is. It's a powerful thing.
So let's go into some of the other benefits of cold plunging.
So one of the other ones that, if you've done any Googling or any YouTubing on the subjects, that has been coming up or that people might see, are some of the metabolic benefits. And so you may have heard of brown fat. People talk about brown fat. And that's a real thing. It's really worth us talking about here in this conversation, because the ultimate benefit that you're getting, and I'll explain how the science works in a moment, is that by doing cold water immersion, you can improve your metabolism, you can reduce your risk of type 2 diabetes and cardiovascular diseases. So that's the punchline, and I'll tell you how we get there. So remember, I mentioned the concept of brown fat. All of us as like babies, when we're born, young children, have a high amount of this brown fat. It's different than what you would think of in terms of white fat, right? So having brown fat doesn't make you fat, and you don't look fat from it. This is deep tissue fat that's concentrated around the clavicles, the upper back, around the heart, and you've got some on your liver. It's really an energy store. One of its purposes is to warm you up and keep you warm. So you can imagine that when you get in the cold plunge, through the pathways to the hypothalamus and the epinephrine and norepinephrine that I talked about earlier, one of the things the norepinephrine does is it activates the brown fat in your body. And when that brown fat gets activated, it needs a fuel source. And fortunately for us, the biology is that the fuel that it needs and that it consumes is glucose and triglycerides. So glucose being blood sugar. So in this way, cold water immersion is a glucose disposal method through this brown fat activation that is agnostic to the activity of your pancreas and insulin release. So it's been shown to improve insulin sensitivity because you're getting rid of blood sugar without having to work and stress the pancreas to release more insulin, forcing those glucose molecules into muscular tissue and so forth.
Okay, explain that in layman's terms.
So in layman's terms, the cold water causes your body to go through a series of chemical processes that then speed up your ability to burn blood sugar and burn calories and energy.
Very cool. So something a lot of people are trying to do through many different methods, and this is one that can compound that and expedite it for sure.
Yeah, and we talked about the blood sugar benefits. That's helpful for anyone. but also especially people with diabetes, type 2 diabetes, and so forth. And then the other piece on the cardiovascular side that I mentioned is that in CWI studies or cold water immersion studies, it's been shown to reduce triglycerides. It's been shown to reduce your LDL cholesterol, which is the more atherogenic cholesterol particles that can cause heart disease. So you'll actually lower that. And it improves your high density lipoproteins or your HDL cholesterol. So if you're regularly, you're not going to get this from one cold plunge, but if you're regularly cold plunging and you're checking your labs, you'll notice, all things equal, an improvement in your cardiovascular lipid profile.
It gets me thinking about the potential impact this has on epigenetics, or people who might have a genetic predisposition to issues with cholesterol or heart disease, and how this might play into turning those switches on or off in a beneficial way.
Absolutely, right? The more you know about your physiology and your genetic predispositions, that's the beautiful thing about all these biohacking things that we study and that we do, is that it's really empowering. I really got into getting to know my labs about 6 years ago when my dad had his first heart attack, because I said, I'm young enough and I feel and look healthy, but I want to know my blood and I want to know these factors that I can start to actually take action on and empower myself to prevent that from happening to myself. Cold plunge is just one of those tools.
This is a big reframe, right? Because we're living in a day and age where the relationship most people have with going to the doctors is much like bringing your car to the mechanic. You go there and you just say, all right, doc, tell me what the problem is. They write the script, you fill it, and there's a lack of empowerment. There's also a lack of accountability. A lot of times I hear people say, the doctor said this, I have to do that. And people feel as if they have no role in A, what might have got them to that point, but B, to be able to impact and change that as they move forward. And it's the opposite of how it was when you look at the times of Hippocrates. It was very much a two-way relationship where the individual needed to know their body fully, and they were working with the doctor to figure things out. And so this is a beautiful way where people can start taking the power back and taking charge of their health.
Absolutely. It's just a form of preventative medicine. Instead of treating the disease once it happens, let's prevent ourselves from getting there through personalized medicine and interventions like this.
Yeah, another added bonus I'll throw on top of that is what I have found certainly is the more I start to build that relationship or conversation with my own body, the more I am able to hear it talking to me, and then even start becoming fluent in certain areas where I get this feedback and I can deal with something before it materializes into something that's a real concern. And so it's such a different way of approaching all of it. It really moves away from that sickness model of symptoms and into a wellness model of prevention, like you said, and maintenance.
Absolutely. Why don't Brian and I quickly touch on a couple of more benefits, and then we can get into protocols and things of that nature if you're interested.
Perfect.
One of the more popular questions I get when people find out I'm in this business, people ask, oh, Steven, what are the benefits that you notice from cold plunge? And I take their question literally. What do I notice? Because I know from the science, some of the things we talked about are happening under the hood, and I don't notice them. I don't know that my brown fat's being activated and that my blood sugar is going lower in real time. But I do notice some things. One of those for me is sleep. I've always struggled with sleep, falling asleep, staying asleep, getting high quality sleep. And as a result of that, I have biohacked my way into trying to improve this element of my life. So I have the 8 sleep bed, which tracks HRV and sleep stages. I have the Aura ring. So I compare that data showing sleep stages, HRV, heart rate, etc. So I am monitoring these things, and it's striking. The days that I miss a cold plunge, the metrics are worse. My latency to fall asleep is longer, and my slow wave deep sleep, I get less of it. And on the days where I do a proper cold plunge, it's remarkably different. It's a day-to-day difference that I can see on the data and I can feel it in my energy level. There's a lot of literature on this, but there was one study that was done in 2021 by first author Chauvin, and it showed that cold water immersion done on the protocol that they studied improved slow wave deep sleep. Obviously, we know that plays an important role in cell growth, cell repair, memory, and even has an immune boosting effect when you get proper sleep. So sleep, as you know, is a foundation of our health. And there's so many different things pharmacologically that we try to do, all these different sleep pills and so forth, lower the lighting at night. There's a lot that we can do. And I've played with all those interventions. And for me, cold water immersion, surprisingly, has been the most potent.
Yeah, I think there's the natural ways of handling it and the unnatural. The body is designed to come back to homeostasis. When fight or flight is initiated, it's a good thing, it's beneficial, but then it comes back to its balancing point. Same thing with our immune system. If there's an attack, all right, we're going to go fight it, then we're going to come back and go into rest and repair. And so these are natural rhythms that are built into the body. And when we look at so many of our external factors, they are trying to hijack our system rather than helping our body to reconnect to its natural wisdom and ability. And so cold plunge is a perfect example of that, and removing outside factors. Lighting, yeah, is one of them, right? Screens, and then you have certain foods or chemicals and products and pharmaceuticals, all of those, which start telling the body not to do what it's designed to do. And so this gets on the right side of that battle for sure.
Yeah, it's very interesting. And there are other things that we don't necessarily even need to go deep into, but I'll just mention at least, which are the immune benefits to cold plunging, just benefits to your immune system. There was one study done by first author Janksy where they ran an experiment with a cohort of athletic young men. And they were really trying to see, does this have any impact on one's immune function? And interestingly, they found that after one session of cold water immersion, there was no measurable effect. But with the continuation and the regular use of consistent cold water therapy, so in the study, they did 3 cold water immersion sessions a week for 6 weeks. It actually increased the proportions of lymphocytes, which are your white blood cells that fight infection and disease, as well as the T helper cells. So those are 2 actual measurable blood markers that improved with the intervention of regular cold water therapy. So I thought that was interesting. And then the other one I'll mention is, of course, this is the one where there's probably the most literature, but I'll spend the least amount of time, is performance and recovery. There's a lot of obvious reasons why that works. One of the reasons is that when you get into cold water, you vasoconstrict. So in other words, your vascular system constricts the blood out of your periphery and it flows it to the core as a survival mechanism, right? So you have the warm blood in your core and your periphery starts to lose the heat quickly. And then when you get out of the cold water, the opposite happens. The blood flushes through the filters of your body, goes out to the periphery and perfuses the blood with fresh oxygen to the muscles. So that's part of the recovery mechanism of action there.
Yeah, and I've read some great studies on things like rheumatoid arthritis or any conditions where you're having circulatory issues like numbing in the hands, fingers, and the toes. Ways to build that back up. I think Wim Hoff does a bunch in that respect as well. And there's so many ways to play with that. I did an episode with Frank Shamrock, a UFC legend, and he said his whole career, the thing that was his saving grace and how he was able to perform and compete for so long, cannabis and ice baths. That's what he did after every single fight, and he just sings the highest of praises. And so there's certain things, yes, the science is good to have. There are other things, you experience it and you just know it to be beneficial. For me, yes, soreness and recovery, absolutely. And if you have any injuries and helping with immune response, and you feel these things and they're very apparent.
They are. Maybe we go to the next most popular question that I get, which is, hey, Steven, how long do we cold plunge?
Yes, please.
What's
Steven,
a proper protocol?
One area I'm curious about is the fact that there's not a one size fits all.
Correct. No, you're absolutely right. For starters, I always try to go back and look at the scientific literature. I don't want to just give my opinion on these things. Who am I to have authority in that way? So there's an article that was getting a lot of attention right now that was published in, Cell Reports Medicine by first author Dr. Susanna Soberg. And this study showed that 11 minutes per week total was enough to convey the types of benefits that we've been talking about today. So that 11 minutes can be broken up into multiple sessions of 3 or 4 minutes and so forth. So that's like the minimum threshold to get some of these benefits is 11 minutes per week if you're doing that. And I can tell you that for myself, I'm blessed enough to have access to a cold plunge and a sauna and this type of contrast therapy. So I'm probably logging more like 30 or 40 minutes a week in the cold. So you can definitely go above 11. Don't feel limited there. That's like one of the litmus tests. And then people ask, how cold? And Dr. Andrew Huberman puts it, he says, just find a temperature that's uncomfortable to you, that when you get in, you want to get out and you have to make yourself stay in, which you can stay in safely for 2 to 3 minutes. That's the poor man's litmus test in terms of how cold whenever you're first starting. So for beginners, I say try a temperature somewhere in the mid to even upper 50s and stay in for 2 to 3 minutes or until you start to shiver. That's the beginner protocol. It's actually funny because my very first customer, Jordan Winart, shout out to Jordan, he asked me how cold he should make it and how long he should plunge. And I know he's a big fan of Tony Robbins. So I said, Jordan, the Tony Robbins protocol, what he does is 10 minutes at 57 degrees. So he set his cold plunge at 56 degrees and he does it for 10 minutes just so he can beat Tony Robbins.
Very nice. But it's great to hear how accessible it is for people who are just starting out. The fact that you don't have to jump in to the 37, 38 degree cold temperature and you can still get the benefits. And look, if you could only do, even at 56 degrees, if you could only do 30 seconds at a time, you can do that multiple times a day and still hit that 11-minute threshold. Those numbers are amazing.
You're absolutely right. And people will surprise themselves. A lot of people, they don't give themselves credit for what they can actually handle when it comes to this. Honestly, after someone's first cold plunge, they pretty much have overcome most of the hesitation and fear, and they start to believe, oh, you know what? I can do this, or that actually felt good. But for people out there that are cold plunging regularly, they probably already have their own protocol. But then I would say if you're somewhat cold adapted, you can start to challenge yourself more with some of the temperatures in the low 40s, high 30s. And then those temperatures, a proper dose is anywhere between 2 to 5 minutes. My protocol is 43 degrees for between 3 and 5 minutes a day. That's what I do. And then a couple of maybe pro tips for people as you're doing your cold plunges. You can think about this as part of your protocol. Fun fact, heat leaves the body and brings in cold most rapidly in 3 places, which is the face, the hands, and the bottom of the feet. So that's why whole body cold water immersion, getting your feet in, your arms, your shoulders, your hands in the water is really beneficial. And you'll see some people also either at the beginning or end of their plunge go fully under and hold your breath a little bit and do like a head dunk. So that's actually the head dunk specifically. Not only does it release the heat and allow you to cool and get even more benefit, but it also has an anti-anxiety and a calming effect, which is data driven. It shows that when you dunk your face and your head completely underwater, it has an additional benefit too.
I remember when I learned about that and started to do that, specifically the data shows that if you do that at the beginning of the plunge, right when you're going in, you overcome that initial shock response a lot faster and you can usually stay in longer, which is a little counterintuitive, but it works.
Right? It shows you how much of it is mental. Yeah. And then the other thing that people ask is if you have access to a hot tub or a cold plunge, contrast therapy, alternating between hot and cold is a popular way to do this. They've been doing that in Scandinavia for a long time and in Russia. it's been a tradition to go between hot and cold. There's something called the Soberg principle, which is science has shown, obviously, and that it makes sense when you think about it, that if you really want to maximize health benefits when doing contrast therapy, you should end on cold. And then not only do you end on cold, but pro tip is don't dry yourself off. Get out of the cold and allow yourself to air dry and even shiver a little bit. And you may experience what's called an after drop, which the after drop is where that cold blood that's in your periphery from being in the cold then starts to exchange into your core. And you might feel even colder and shiver a little bit because you're getting an exchange of colder blood into the core immediately after the cold plunge. And so if you make your body work to reheat itself naturally, you're getting that extra metabolic benefit.
Yeah, I remember I was so pissed when I heard that one, because there's something so nice at the end of it of rewarding yourself with the hot shower. And it's no, not yet. I also heard...
Sure, true.
Yeah, I'm also curious. I heard that doing the cold plunge before your workout is more beneficial than doing it after. Do you have any insights there?
Yeah, that's also a question that I get a lot. And if you look online, there's kind of some mixed information on this, but I can tell you what the science says. They did a study on athletes with post-exercise use. So we'll start with post-exercise. There's the most data on that. And that's very clear that there's benefit in nearly all cases because it reduces delayed onset muscle soreness and many other things, like reduces inflammation and so forth. The one case that really, I think, gets a lot more publicity than it should online, which is the science that says if you are doing hypertrophy exercise, like heavy muscle lifting, and your only goal is to optimize for muscle building, then hopping in the cold plunge immediately after weightlifting is slightly counterproductive because it does blunt some of the inflammation that's causing your muscles to then grow. So you're supposed to wait at least 3 hours after a hypertrophy exercise before you cold plunge. Before cold plunge, they actually did a study with some elite runners that were athletes to try to see, does this actually improve performance doing cold plunge 10, 15 minutes before a run? And surprisingly, you would think people would come out and be cold and stiff and it would be a problem. What they found is the cohort of young athletes that actually did cold water immersion prior to running had higher performance. One of those reasons, some of those reasons are physiological that have to do with vasodilation and circulation and reduction of inflammation. But some of it is actually probably mental because they do get that dopamine release. And that gives them an extra level of motivation. So when they go in for a hard training run, their mind is already in a really healthy space where they're associating the effort with a good feeling versus the effort with a bad feeling. So that it could be also mental why the performance is greater. But have you heard anything different, Brian, on that?
No, that was very much more in depth than what I had read. Steven, another area that is near and dear to both of our hearts, and I think it plays in very well to this, both historically and traditionally in different cultures, but now more than ever, we are craving is community. I know community has been the glue that holds this together for you. Can you go into that a bit?
Yeah, absolutely. The community and the people and relationships piece is really my personal why I created Fjord and why I'm doing this business. If my goal was to make as much money as possible, I might be doing a different business if that was the only thing I was optimizing for. But community's been great. Austin, so I live in Austin. The company is based here. And it's a culture that loves to reward local and support local businesses. So I've really leaned into that with Fjord, and I opt in pretty often to doing pop-ups and partnerships with gyms, with yoga studios, with cycling studios, wellness camps, things of that nature, because I want to be there to add value in the way that I can with cold plunge and with educating people on the benefits at these events. So I try to get out into the community from a business standpoint. And then also something that's a little bit closer to home, you and I talked a little bit about this off camera, which is once a month, I do a Fjord headquarters wellness day, which is something that I put out to my community and invite people over to take advantage of the sauna, the hot tub. We have a cold dipping pool, and then we have a really cold plunge. So I want people to build community around this and not view it as something that you have to do in isolation early in the morning by yourself. It can be that, but that's one reason why I sell an extra large tub, the XL 2-person tub, is because you can get 2 people in there and do cold plunge challenges. You can make it something social.
Yeah, look, this is something that I've been talking about lately in human beings. This misnomer that we've been taught that we've got to self-regulate and go at things alone. And we start to put a bad name to anything where there's a co-regulation happening. And in reality, our nervous systems, especially in healthy environments, are wired to co-regulate, first with our mother and our father and our nucleus environment. But then as we join these tribes or social groups, and as adults, the ability to spend our time with people who help us to regulate our own nervous system and our own minds is so powerful. And doing hard things together where we're supporting through that, you're really building a hardwired skill that carries over into all areas of life.
From running fitness camps, that there is something special about going through something difficult with someone else that bonds 2 people together differently than it would to just go out and get drinks at a bar or something. So I think it's healthy from that perspective.
Yeah, there's often this label of trauma bond thrown around, and I think we need another one. There might be another name, but trauma bond being some traumatic event that people go through, and as such, they have this unique bond. There's also these more stoic hardships that we put ourselves through to get stronger and to test our grit and our resilience and to cultivate it. And so we need a name for what that is, because this is a healthy version of it where we're choosing to do this together. Maybe it's a growth bond, something where we're growing together.
This being the Growth Guide podcast, why don't we just call it the Growth Bond? That's why we named my Plungecast Freezing for a reason.
Love it.
We're in here for a reason. Part of that's community.
Yeah. There's something real about it. And it's not just that things are easier when we do it together, but when we go through hardship together, then the community is cultivating a resilience so that when it gets challenged, and it will, we have a reserve to call from to put into action. Versus how many times do we hear about things where like, oh yeah, this person's so great, and then this happened and they just fell to pieces. If we don't build these skills and really fortify ourselves for that, we don't know how we're going to respond. We don't know how the people around us are going to respond. And so it's a great practice just in really cultivating that. Because it is a learnable skill.
It is. It's learnable. And as long as you can get access to cold water, even if you don't have a cold plunge, it can be a river, a lake, an ocean, a sea, anything you have access to. Give yourself a challenge.
Even read there's a lot of the same benefits you get. It's not exactly the same, but a lot of the benefits, if you take a bowl of water and throw a ton of ice in it and just soaking the front of your face, you're getting some of those benefits. Yeah, don't ever let anything hold you back from at least doing a version of it. It might not be the optimal version, but find what's accessible.
Absolutely. I agree.
Steven, what else have you been learning in getting these wellness days going?
Yeah, one of the things I've learned, or I just observed, is how the health and fitness community in Austin, anyways, I can speak to that. We all generally want to help each other. We all generally want to rally around and understand how we can partner and be helpful to each other. So I think that's been great. There's a lot of really interesting people that are thought leaders, that are movers and shakers doing their own things in these pockets in the health and fitness community in Austin. So for the past year since I've stepped into this business, it's been a process of discovering all of these new great people that make up the Austin community. And of course, it ends up being just like anything else, a small world where you know so-and-so and everyone knows each other. And it's really wonderful. So I've learned a lot from other entrepreneurs in Austin. Speaking of learning things, I think one of the lessons that I learned when starting this business that I wish I could go back and tell myself to ask for help and bring in and form a team earlier. I think I tried to do too much on my own in the beginning. And then once I had resources and a team and people to bounce ideas off of and to share delegation and roles, it made a world of difference. I waited a little too long for that. And now we've remedied that. Because we're talking about community, and even within the company, it's great to have a community of people that believe in the mission.
And building a culture where you can ask for help, where you don't need to carry that burden of getting everything right and doing it all yourself. We have a large culture of that, I think, in our society. And yeah, creating spaces that you're safe to drop the guard and be like, look, I need help. I'm struggling, or I'm just out of bandwidth. Like, what can we do here? It's powerful.
100%, right? Not thinking that you have to be going all alone as a lone wolf and a warrior there. I think the other thing that I know cognitively as a consultant, I was trained in some of these areas, but then applying them to your own small business is a different matter in the execution phase. But one of the things that I tried to do a good job of, and we're really continuing to lean into, is not assuming that I know what my customers value, but I want to go out and ask my customers, do those interviews, and really understand what in consulting we would call the voice of the customer. What are all the different careabouts, and what's the magnitude of those careabouts? And then make sure our offering is beating competition in those categories.
Love it, Steven. Thank you so much for taking time to come on the show and giving us a lot of information around cold plunging and the benefits.
Thank you, Brian. Been a pleasure.
Thanks for joining us this week on Growth Guide. A big thanks to our sponsors, Atmananda Yoga. You guys have got to check out their yoga alignment mat. I've been using this for a long time. As you know by now, I've studied and trained with them as a yoga teacher, and the mat is incredible to deepen your practice and to ensure a lifelong injury-free practice. Visit growthguide.love/alignment for more info or to buy. Be sure to use code GROWTH at checkout for 15% off. One of the perks of hosting your own podcast is that you could sponsor your own brand. On that note, this episode is sponsored by Spirit Squad. You tired of your Matrix standard issued uniform? Have you pulled the thread and need some new ones? This calls for some 5D level ascension gear, such as our 432Hz classic hoodie and our Resist the Program Third Eye Kitty tee. Spirit Squad's got you covered. From ceremony gear to pre-ceremony gear to post-ceremony gear, we have anti-ceremony gear too. Are you raising consciousness while little ones are raising hell? We have the perfect gear for drop-off, pickup, and serving in the 3-foot kingdom. While you're at it, Spirit Squad has mini sizes, like our Feral Child shirt, strong enough for your little, yet sends a message to the fearful and weak. Give this one some space. Grab your Spirit Squad gear now at spiritsquadsupply.com. And welcome to the rebellion. Make sure to visit our website, growthguide.love, where you can find freebies, exclusive content, and subscribe to the show so you'll never miss an episode. If you found value in listening, I'd really appreciate a rating on iTunes. I can't tell you just how important this is. Or spread the love. Tell your friends, your fam, heck, tell your spirit animals. And follow me on Instagram at growthguide.love.